March 17, 1943. 06:23 hours. Bridge of the light cruiser Sendai, Bougainville Strait, Solomon Islands. Captain Nakamura Hiroshi adjusted his rangefinder and smiled with satisfaction. The morning patrol had proceeded exactly as doctrine predicted. His ship glided through the crystalline waters of the strait, barely 18 feet beneath her keel, protected by geography itself from the American submarine menace that plagued deeper waters. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The shallow coastal passages of the Solomon Chain had become Japan's maritime highways, sanctuaries where enemy submarines dare not venture. Every Naval Academy graduate knew the fundamental truth. Submarines require deep water to operate effectively, to dive, to maneuver, to escape. The Americans, like all submarine forces, would avoid these treacherous shallows where their boats risked grounding, where escape routes vanished, where the very seabed became an enemy. Nakamura lowered his binoculars and turned to his navigation officer with the confidence of a man whose certainty had never been challenged. "Maintain course through the channel," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of naval service. "The Americans learned their lesson at Guadalcanal. They won't risk their precious submarines in these waters again." Lieutenant Sasaki Kenji, fresh from the Naval Academy at Eta Jima, nodded respectfully, but harbored private doubts. The previous week, 2 destroyers had reported unusual underwater disturbances in similar shallow areas. Both incidents had been dismissed as whale activity or current anomalies. Sasaki had read the reports with growing unease, but challenging senior officers remained unthinkable in the Imperial Navy's rigid hierarchy. 14 minutes later, 3 torpedoes from USS Trigger, operating in merely 16 feet of water, tore through Sendai's hull. The cruiser's magazine detonated in a pillar of flame visible 20 miles away. As Captain Nakamura struggled in the oil-slick shallows, watching his command disappear beneath 18 feet of water, he experienced something Japanese naval doctrine had declared impossible for 2 years of warfare. American submarines had learned to hunt in waters so shallow that their periscopes scraped the bottom at low tide. They had mastered techniques that violated every principle of submarine warfare taught at Annapolis, techniques that transformed Japan's coastal sanctuaries into killing grounds. The mathematics of shallow water warfare were being written in torpedo tracks across coral reefs and sandy bottoms where submarines should never venture. Yet even as their coastal shipping lanes became graveyards, Japanese naval leadership could not, would not, accept that American submarine commanders had revolutionized underwater warfare itself. The evidence accumulated in wrecked hulls and missing convoys, but institutional arrogance and doctrinal blindness prevented recognition of a tactical evolution that would transform the Pacific War. The roots of Japan's shallow water blindness stretched back to the naval treaties of the 1920s, when submarine warfare doctrine crystallized around assumptions that would prove catastrophic 20 years later. The Imperial Navy's Submarine Warfare Manual, revised in 1934 and still governing tactical thinking in 1943, devoted exactly 3 paragraphs to shallow water operations. All 3 emphasize the same fundamental principle. Submarines avoid shallow areas due to operational impossibility and extreme vulnerability. This doctrine emerged from solid theoretical foundations. Traditional submarine design prioritized deep diving capability, long-range patrol endurance, and surface speed for transit. Shallow water presented multiple dangers: limited maneuvering room, restricted dive angles, increased detection probability, and catastrophic consequences if forced to surface under fire. Every submarine captain should landed learned these principles, and every surface commander learned to exploit them. Commander Yamamoto Seiki, who graduated first in his class from the Naval War College in 1935, later wrote in his memoirs, "We studied American submarine capabilities exhaustively. Their boats were designed for deep ocean patrol, extended voyages, and engagement with major fleet units. The concept of modified tactics for coastal operations never appeared in our intelligence estimates. We assumed they would follow proven doctrine because deviation seemed suicidal." This assumption shaped Japanese coastal defense strategy throughout the early war years. Major naval bases like Rabaul, Truk, and Palau were positioned to control deep-water approaches with minimal attention paid to shallow coastal channels. Minefields protected main harbors, but secondary anchorages in shallow bays remained largely undefended. The Japanese Navy's resource allocation reflected their confidence. Anti-submarine patrols concentrated on deep-water areas, while coastal regions received minimal coverage. The American submarine force that began operating in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor initially confirmed Japanese expectations. Early patrol reports from USS submarines described cautious approaches to shallow areas, standard deep-water attack patterns, and withdrawal to oceanic depths after engagements. These reports, intercepted and analyzed by Japanese intelligence, reinforced existing doctrine. American submarines appeared to be following predictable patterns that validated Japanese defensive arrangements. Lieutenant Commander Ishii Masao, serving in naval intelligence at Combined Fleet Headquarters, compiled monthly assessments of submarine activity patterns. His February 1942 report stated with confidence, "Enemy submarine operations conform to established doctrine. No significant tactical innovations observed. Patrol areas concentrate on deep-water shipping lanes. Coastal approaches remain secure from submarine threat." This assessment would prove disastrously wrong within 18 months, but in early 1942, available evidence supported Ishii's conclusions. American submarines were indeed avoiding shallow waters, following standard patrol doctrines developed in peacetime exercises. The tactical revolution that would transform Pacific submarine warfare had not yet begun. The first hints of change appeared in isolated incidents that Japanese intelligence either missed or misinterpreted. In April 1942, USS Seawolf reported attacking a Japanese transport in unusually shallow water near the Philippines, but the attack failed when torpedoes struck the bottom before reaching their target. The incident report, filed routinely, noted water depth as insufficient for standard attack approaches. Similar reports began accumulating throughout 1942. USS Salmon attempted attacks in shallow areas near New Guinea, but experienced multiple torpedo malfunctions in restricted waters. USS Sargo reported depth charging in coastal areas where submarines theoretically couldn't operate, but attributed Japanese anti-submarine activity to mistaken whale sightings. These scattered reports suggested American willingness to explore shallow water operations, but consistent failures indicated the futility of such attempts. Japanese naval intelligence, monitoring American radio traffic and analyzing patrol patterns, noted these shallow water probes, but interpreted them as tactical desperation rather than doctrinal evolution. Commander Fuji Yoshio, responsible for submarine threat assessment, reported in August 1942, enemy submarines demonstrate increasing willingness to risk shallow water approaches, indicating pressure for results despite operational limitations. These desperate measures confirm our effectiveness of our coastal defense strategy. The Japanese analysis contained a crucial flaw that would prove fatal. They assumed American submarine commanders were being forced into shallow waters by Japanese defensive success in deeper areas, interpreting tactical experimentation as evidence of American weakness rather than doctrinal evolution.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Innovation. This misreading prevented recognition of systematic American efforts to develop new capabilities specifically designed for shallow water warfare. The transformation began quietly in American submarine bases across the Pacific, where commanders and crews started developing techniques that violated every principle of traditional submarine doctrine. The initiative came not from high command directives, but from individual commanders frustrated by missed opportunities in coastal areas where valuable targets operated beyond reach of conventional attacks. Lieutenant Commander Howard Gilmore of USS Growler pioneered some of the earliest shallow water techniques during patrols near the Bismarcks in late 1942. His patrol reports, declassified decades later, reveal systematic experimentation with ultra-shallow operations. Gilmore's crew practiced bottom navigation using echo sounders to maintain precise depth control in areas where traditional sonar became unreliable due to thermoclines and bottom interference. The technical challenges were immense. Shallow water created acoustic anomalies that confused standard sonar equipment. Temperature layers near the surface bent sound waves unpredictably. Coral reefs and irregular bottom contours required constant navigation adjustments. Traditional torpedo running depths proved useless when total water depth barely exceeded torpedo length. Every aspect of submarine warfare required modification for the shallow water environment. Growler's engineering officer, Lieutenant Charles Andrews, documented the modifications necessary for shallow water operations. Ballast tank procedures were revised to achieve neutral buoyancy with minimal margin for error. Torpedo firing solutions required new calculations accounting for bottom interaction effects. Navigation techniques adapted coastal piloting methods to underwater conditions. Most critically, escape and evasion tactics needed complete reimagining when diving deep became impossible. These modifications remained largely theoretical until December 1942, when Growler achieved the first confirmed shallow water torpedo kill. Operating in barely 22 feet of water near Kolombangara, Gilmore's crew sank the Japanese transport Chifuku Maru using specially modified torpedoes set to run at maximum shallow depth. The success demonstrated that shallow water submarine warfare, while incredibly dangerous, was technically feasible with proper equipment and training. Word of Growler's success spread rapidly through the American submarine force, sparking intense interest in shallow water capabilities. Commander Charles Lockwood, commanding Submarine Force Pacific, ordered systematic investigation of shallow water techniques. Selected submarines began conducting experimental patrols specifically designed to develop and test new tactical methods for coastal operations. The experimentation process proved costly and dangerous. USS Argonaut ran aground during shallow water trials near Guadalcanal, requiring extensive repairs. USS Grampus suffered torpedo compartment flooding when attempting bottom running in coral areas. USS Triton reported multiple close calls with Japanese surface patrols that detected submarines operating in areas previously considered safe from underwater threat. These setbacks reinforced Japanese confidence in their coastal defense strategy. Intelligence reports of American submarine difficulties in shallow areas seem to confirm that such operations remained impractical despite apparent American desperation. Commander Nishimura Teiji, analyzing submarine incident reports, concluded in January 1943,
And development. New torpedo modifications allowed reliable operation in restricted depths. Sonar equipment was being adapted for shallow water conditions. Most importantly, American submarine crews were developing the specialized skills necessary for effective shallow water combat. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Chief torpedoman Marcus Johnson, serving aboard USS Tang, developed a technique for using torpedo gyroscope angles to compensate for shallow water running characteristics. His method allowed accurate torpedo shots in depths previously considered impossible for submarine attacks. Johnson's innovation, shared through informal networks among submarine crews, revolutionized shallow water attack capabilities almost overnight. By February 1943, American submarines were achieving consistent success in waters that Japanese doctrine declared off-limits to submarine operations. The tactical revolution was complete, but Japanese recognition of the transformation would lag months behind reality. The gap between American capability and Japanese awareness was widening into a chasm that would swallow dozens of Japanese vessels operating in supposedly safe coastal waters. The first systematic Japanese encounter with evolved American shallow water capabilities came during Operation I-Go, Admiral Yamamoto's aerial offensive against Allied positions in the Solomons. Japanese naval forces moved through coastal channels, relying on shallow water protection while staging aircraft from forward bases. The operation's success depended on secure maritime logistics through areas where submarines posed no threat, according to established doctrine. Rear Admiral Kusaka Gini, commanding the operation's naval component, positioned his forces with confidence born of 2 years' successful shallow water operations. Light cruisers and destroyers moved freely through channels barely deep enough to accommodate their draft, escorting transports laden with aviation supplies and maintenance personnel. Anti-submarine patrols concentrated on deep water approaches, leaving coastal routes essentially unguarded except for routine air reconnaissance. The American submarine force had been monitoring Japanese coastal operations for weeks, noting the predictable patterns that made effective ambush possible. USS Trigger, under Lieutenant Commander Roy Benson, had spent 10 days studying Japanese movement schedules in the Bougainville area. Benson's patrol log reveals meticulous preparation for shallow water attacks that would have been impossible just months earlier. Trigger's crew had practiced the attack scenario repeatedly, using captured Japanese charts to identify optimal firing positions in the coral-studded channels. Technical preparations included torpedo depth modifications, sonar adjustments for shallow water acoustics, and ballast procedures designed for minimal depth margins. Every aspect of the attack required precision impossible with traditional submarine techniques. The attack on Sendai represented the culmination of months of tactical development and crew training. Trigger approached the target through a channel so shallow that her conning tower occasionally broached the surface at low tide. Benson maintained position by literally resting the submarine's keel on the sandy bottom, a technique that would have been considered impossibly dangerous under traditional doctrine. Japanese lookouts aboard Sendai never suspected submarine presence in such restricted waters. The cruiser maintained standard formation with minimal zigzagging, confident in the protection offered by shallow depth. When Trigger's torpedoes struck, the psychological impact exceeded even the physical destruction. Japanese naval personnel found themselves under submarine attack in waters they considered absolutely safe from underwater threat. The attack's success sent shockwaves through Japanese naval command, but the initial response revealed the depth of doctrinal blindness that would characterize Japanese reactions throughout the
shallow water campaign. Rather than acknowledging revolutionary American capabilities, Japanese investigators sought explanations that preserved existing doctrine while accounting for the impossible attack. Captain Okada Jisaku, dispatched to investigate Sendai's loss, filed a report that demonstrated remarkable creativity in avoiding obvious conclusions. His official assessment attributed the sinking to a mine strike, despite clear evidence of torpedo damage and survivor testimony describing multiple explosions characteristic of submarine attack. The report noted unusual circumstances, but concluded that mine warfare remained the most likely explanation for the loss. This pattern of misattribution would define Japanese responses to shallow water submarine attacks throughout 1943. Each incident was explained through increasingly elaborate theories that avoided acknowledging American tactical innovation. Mines became the favored explanation, despite the absence of American mining operations in most affected areas.
Alternative theories included shore-based torpedo batteries, midget submarines, and even sabotage by local resistance groups. The institutional resistance to accepting shallow-water submarine capabilities reflected deeper problems within Japanese naval culture. Acknowledging American tactical superiority required admitting fundamental errors in Japanese doctrine, training, and defensive planning. Such admission challenged the competence of senior officers whose careers were built on the established system. The psychological pressure to maintain existing beliefs overcame evidence that should have forced doctrinal revision. Commander Watanabe Kazuo, serving on the Naval General Staff, later testified about the institutional dynamics that prevented recognition of American shallow-water capabilities. We received consistent reports of submarine attacks in impossible locations. Each report was individually explained through alternative theories. The pattern was never acknowledged because recognizing it would require completely rebuilding our coastal defense strategy. The institutional cost of admission seemed greater than the operational cost of continued losses. This decision to maintain comfortable illusions rather than confront uncomfortable realities established the framework for systematic denial that would characterize Japanese responses throughout the shallow-water submarine campaign. As American capabilities improved and attacks intensified, Japanese explanations became increasingly divorced from reality, creating a cognitive prism that trapped Japanese tactical thinking until the war's end. The technical mastery demonstrated in Trigger's attack on Sendai was quickly replicated across the American submarine force. Successful shallow-water techniques spread through informal networks among submarine crews, accelerated by the competitive spirit that characterized American submarine operations. Commanders who achieved shallow-water successes were celebrated and consulted, their methods studied and adapted by colleagues seeking similar achievements. USS Wahoo, under the legendary Commander Dudley Morton, became the next submarine to achieve spectacular shallow-water success. Morton's attack on a Japanese convoy in the restricted waters near Wewak demonstrated that shallow-water techniques could be scaled up for multiple target engagements. Operating in depths that barely accommodated his submarine's length, Morton sank 3 transports and damaged 2 escorts in a single engagement that lasted less than an hour. The Wewak attack revealed Japanese defensive vulnerabilities that extended far beyond simple tactical surprise. Japanese anti-submarine procedures, developed for deep-water environments, proved completely inadequate for shallow-water conditions. Depth charges set for standard deep running exploded harmlessly above submerged submarines resting on the bottom. Sonar searches followed predictable patterns that ignored areas where traditional submarines couldn't operate, but where other submarines could be found.
Modified American boats could lurk undetected. Morton's patrol report described Japanese confusion during the attack with almost clinical detachment. Enemy escorts responded with standard deep-water anti-submarine procedures. Depth charges were dropped in patterns appropriate for submarines at 150 feet depth. We were resting on the bottom at 38 feet. Their sonar searches concentrated on deep-water areas, while we maneuvered in the shallows they considered impossible for submarine operations. Enemy confusion was total and predictable. The success of shallow-water operations began attracting attention from American Submarine Force Command, leading to systematic efforts to develop and disseminate shallow-water tactics throughout the Pacific Submarine Fleet. Technical bureaus began designing equipment specifically for shallow-water operations. Training programs incorporated shallow-water scenarios. Most importantly, intelligence services began identifying Japanese coastal patterns that could be exploited through shallow-water submarine attacks. The intelligence component proved crucial to shallow-water success. Unlike deep-water patrols where submarines could loiter for extended periods, shallow-water operations required precise timing and positioning. Submarines operating near the bottom in restricted areas had limited ability to adjust position once committed to an attack. Success demanded detailed knowledge of Japanese movement schedules, routing patterns, and defensive arrangements. American code-breaking capabilities provided exactly this intelligence. Japanese naval communications, compromised since early 1942, revealed detailed information about coastal shipping schedules, escort arrangements, and defensive procedures. This intelligence allowed American submarine commanders to position their boats with precision, impossible through traditional patrol methods, maximizing the effectiveness of shallow water techniques. The combination of technical innovation, tactical development, and superior intelligence created a force multiplication effect that transformed shallow water submarine warfare from experimental technique to systematic campaign. By mid-1943, American submarines were achieving consistent success in areas Japanese doctrine declared off-limits to submarine operations. The tactical revolution was complete, but Japanese recognition remained months away. The escalation of shallow water attacks through spring 1943 created a crisis of explanation within Japanese Naval Command. Individual incidents could be attributed to mines or alternative causes, but the pattern of losses in shallow coastal areas demanded more systematic analysis. The geographic concentration of incidents, the consistency of damage patterns, and the tactical signatures all pointed toward submarine attacks using previously unknown techniques. Yet Japanese naval intelligence continued producing assessments that avoided acknowledging American shallow water capabilities. The institutional investment in existing doctrine created powerful incentives for alternative explanations, no matter how elaborate or implausible. Mine warfare theories became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating detailed explanations of how American forces might have deployed undetected minefields in areas under Japanese control. The psychological resistance to acknowledging American tactical innovation reflected deeper cultural factors that would plague Japanese military adaptation throughout the war. The concept of technical or tactical superiority being achieved by enemy forces challenged fundamental assumptions about Japanese military excellence. Admitting that American submarine crews had developed capabilities superior to Japanese expectations required acknowledging inferiority that was culturally and institutionally unacceptable. This denial mechanism extended beyond Naval Command to affect Japanese defensive arrangements throughout the Pacific. Coastal defenses continued to focus on deep-water areas approaches while shallow areas remained essentially unprotected. Anti-submarine training emphasized traditional deep-water techniques, while ignoring the tactical innovations that were systematically destroying Japanese coastal shipping. Resource allocation reflected confidence in shallow water security that was becoming increasingly divorced from operational reality. The gap between Japanese perception and American capability was widening daily, creating conditions for catastrophic surprise attacks that would define the next phase of the shallow water submarine campaign. As American techniques improved and Japanese awareness lagged, the stage was set for systematic destruction of Japanese coastal operations through tactics that violated every principle of established submarine doctrine. The transformation of American shallow water capabilities from experimental technique to operational doctrine represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War. Within months, American submarine crews had overcome technical challenges that military theorists considered insurmountable, developing new methods that would revolutionize naval warfare. The implications extended far beyond individual attacks to threaten Japan's entire coastal defense strategy. Yet Japanese recognition of this transformation remained imprisoned by institutional blindness and cultural resistance to acknowledging enemy innovation. The stage was set for a campaign of systematic destruction that would unfold in waters Japanese doctrine declared safe from submarine threat. The mathematics of shallow water warfare were about to be written in the wreckage of Japanese coastal shipping, one torpedo attack at a time. May 8, 1943. 14:47 hours. Chart room of destroyer Hamikaze, Shortland Islands, anchorage. Commander Sato Ichiro spread the latest reconnaissance photographs across the plotting table with growing unease. The aerial images showed 17 cargo vessels anchored in the protected shallows of Rakata Bay, their hulls resting in water so shallow that loading operations required careful timing with the tides. According to every principle of naval warfare, these ships were absolutely secure from submarine attack. Yet 5 similar concentrations had vanished over the past month, their disappearance attributed to an increasingly creative catalog of explanations that strained credibility.
Sato studied the photographs with the methodical attention of a destroyer commander who had survived 2 years of Pacific warfare through careful observation of patterns that others missed. The anchorages chosen by transport commanders followed predictable logic, seeking the shallowest possible water that could still accommodate their vessels. Each location offered the same supposed protection, depths too restricted for enemy submarines to operate. The pattern disturbed Sato because it revealed a fundamental flaw in Japanese tactical thinking. If American submarines couldn't attack in shallow water, why were shallow water anchorages suffering such catastrophic losses? The official explanations grew more elaborate with each incident, but none addressed the obvious question that haunted experienced naval officers like Sato. Either American submarines had developed impossible capabilities, or Japanese doctrine contained fatal blind spots that were systematically exploited by an increasingly aggressive enemy. Sato's concerns would prove prophetic within hours. At 0347 the following morning, USS Silversides, operating in 11 feet of water at high tide, launched a coordinated attack that destroyed 13 of the 17 vessels anchored in Rakata Bay. The submarine crew had literally crawled across the bottom during low tide, positioning themselves for an attack that Japanese defenders considered physically impossible. When the torpedoes struck, Japanese forces found themselves witnessing the systematic destruction of a supposedly invulnerable anchorage by an enemy that wasn't supposed to exist in such waters. The Rakata Bay massacre marked the transition from isolated incidents
to systematic campaign. American shallow water techniques had evolved beyond experimental tactics to operational doctrine capable of destroying entire Japanese logistics networks. The technical mastery required for such operations represented a quantum leap in submarine warfare capabilities that challenged every assumption about underwater combat limitations. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, had spent weeks preparing for the Rakata Bay operation using intelligence gathered from multiple sources. Japanese radio intercepts revealed the anchorage's location and the arrival schedule for the transport convoy. Aerial reconnaissance provided detailed bathymetric data showing underwater topography. Most crucially, captured Japanese charts revealed defensive arrangements that assumed submarine attack remained impossible in such restricted waters. Barb's approach to Rakata Bay required navigation techniques that violated fundamental submarine safety protocols. The submarine approached the target area during darkness, using modified sonar equipment designed specifically for shallow water navigation. Fluckey's crew had practiced the attack scenario using scale models and underwater terrain maps, rehearsing every aspect of the operation until crew responses became automatic. The precision required left no margin for error or improvisation. The technical modifications necessary for Rakata Bay demonstrated how far American shallow water capabilities had advanced since the early experimental attacks. Barb carried specially modified torpedoes designed to run reliably in depths that barely exceeded torpedo diameter. Navigation equipment had been recalibrated for acoustic conditions unique to shallow water environments. Most importantly, ballast and trim procedures had been completely redesigned to achieve precise depth control in areas where traditional submarine buoyancy management became impossible. The attack itself unfolded with mechanical precision that reflected months of preparation and training. Barb approached the anchorage submerged, maintaining position through careful manipulation of ballast tanks while resting intermittently on the sandy bottom. Fluckey positioned his submarine to maximize target coverage, using gyroscope angles to spread torpedo attacks across the entire anchorage. The coordination required for simultaneous attacks on multiple targets exceeded anything attempted in traditional deepwater submarine operations. Japanese defensive response revealed the complete inadequacy of anti-submarine measures designed for conventional threats. Patrol vessels immediately began standard deep-water search patterns, dropping depth charges set for submarines operating at traditional depths. The explosions occurred 60 to 80 feet above Barb's actual position, creating impressive service displays while causing no damage to the submarine resting on the bottom. Japanese sonar searches followed predictable protocols that ignored areas where conventional submarines couldn't operate, but where modified American boats could maneuver undetected. The psychological impact of Rakata Bay exceeded even the massive material losses. Japanese naval personnel witnessed the destruction of a theoretically invulnerable position by an enemy whose presence should have been impossible. The attack challenged fundamental assumptions about submarine warfare that had guided Japanese defensive planning since the war's beginning. More disturbing still, the precision and coordination of the attack suggested systematic American capabilities rather than isolated tactical innovation. Yet, Japanese Naval Command's official response to Rakata Bay demonstrated the institutional blindness that would characterize their reactions throughout the shallow water campaign. Rather than acknowledging revolutionary American submarine capabilities, investigators again sought explanations that preserved existing doctrine while accounting for seemingly impossible results. The official report identified a mass Japanese minefield as the only reasonable cause of the transport destruction. Assessment attributed the losses to a coordinated mine and air attack, despite the absence of American mining operations or aircraft in the area during the attack period. Captain Yamada Shigetaro, assigned to investigate the Rakata Bay incident, produced a report that exemplified the cognitive gymnastics necessary to maintain doctrinal orthodoxy while explaining inexplicable results. His analysis acknowledged the precision and coordination of the attack while attributing it to carefully planned mining operations executed months earlier by American forces. The report noted that some mine types could remain dormant for extended periods before activation by magnetic or acoustic triggers, explaining the simultaneous nature of the explosions. This explanation required assuming American forces had possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese anchorage plans months in advance, had successfully infiltrated heavily defended waters to plant sophisticated mines, and had somehow coordinated mine detonation to achieve effects identical to submarine torpedo attacks. The implausibility of this scenario was less important than its preservation of fundamental doctrine about submarine limitations in shallow water environments. The pattern of institutional denial established at Rakata Bay would govern Japanese responses to increasingly devastating shallow water attacks throughout 1943. Each incident was individually explained through increasingly creative theories that avoided acknowledging the obvious pattern of American tactical innovation. The cumulative effect created a parallel reality where Japanese defensive planning proceeded according to doctrine that bore no relationship to actual American capabilities. Commander Watanabe Masao, serving in the operations section of Combined Fleet Headquarters, later testified about the psychological mechanisms that sustained this denial. We received detailed reports of impossible submarine attacks in areas where submarine operations couldn't occur. Each report was analyzed in isolation, with alternative explanations developed to avoid acknowledging the pattern. Admitting that American submarines could operate effectively in shallow water would require rebuilding our entire coastal defense strategy. The institutional cost of such admission seemed greater than accepting individual losses through unknown causes. This decision to maintain comfortable illusions rather than confront uncomfortable realities trapped Japanese strategic thinking in a cognitive prison that prevented effective response to American shallow water capabilities. As attacks intensified and losses mounted, Japanese explanations became increasingly divorced from observable reality, creating conditions for systematic destruction of coastal shipping networks through tactics that official doctrine declared impossible. The success of operations like Rakata Bay transformed shallow water submarine warfare from experimental technique to systematic campaign capable of paralyzing Japanese logistics networks throughout the Pacific. American submarine commanders, emboldened by repeated successes in supposedly impossible conditions, began planning increasingly ambitious operations that exploited Japanese defensive blindness with devastating effectiveness. USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, achieved the next major breakthrough in shallow water warfare with a series of attacks in the Carolines that demonstrated the scalability of shallow water techniques. Operating in areas where water depth rarely exceeded 30 feet, Tang destroyed 23 Japanese vessels over a 6-week period, systematically eliminating Japanese shipping in an entire island chain through attacks that Japanese doctrine considered physically impossible. O'Kane's tactics represented the evolution of shallow water warfare from individual attacks to sustained campaign operations. Tang operated from concealed positions in coral lagoons, using captured Japanese charts to identify hiding places invisible to surface observation. The submarine crew developed techniques for extended shallow water operations that allowed sustained presence in enemy-controlled areas without the deep-water refuges that traditional submarine doctrine considered essential for survival. The technical innovations required for Tang's Caroline operations pushed shallow water capabilities to theoretical limits. The submarine operated for extended periods with less than 10 feet of water above the conning tower, using specially modified breathing apparatus that allowed surface ventilation without visual detection. Navigation relied entirely on acoustic methods and compass bearings, as periscope observation became impossible in the restricted waters where Tang conducted operations. The precision required for sustained shallow water operations exceeded anything attempted in conventional submarine warfare. Tang's crew maintained position through minute adjustments to ballast and trim, compensating for tidal changes that could ground the submarine or expose it to visual detection. Attack solutions required calculations that accounted for bottom interaction effects, current variations, and acoustic anomalies unique to shallow water environments. Every aspect of submarine operations had been modified for conditions that traditional doctrine declared unsurvivable. The results of Tang's Caroline campaign devastated Japanese logistics networks throughout the Central Pacific. The systematic destruction of inter-island shipping severed communication lines between major Japanese bases, forcing reliance on air transport for supplies that required maritime delivery. Japanese forces found themselves isolated in island strongholds, cut off from support networks by an enemy that operated in waters previously considered secure from submarine threat. Japanese attempts to counter Tang's operations revealed the complete inadequacy of anti-submarine measures designed for conventional threats. Patrol vessels sent to hunt the submarine followed standard search patterns that ignored shallow water areas where Tang actually operated. When acoustic contacts were detected in shallow regions, Japanese forces attributed them to whale activity or acoustic anomalies rather than submarine presence. The institutional assumption that submarines couldn't operate in such waters prevented effective countermeasures against an enemy that had mastered precisely such operations. The intelligence implications of sustained shallow water operations proved as devastating as the material losses. American submarines operating undetected in supposedly secure waters gathered detailed information about Japanese defensive arrangements, supply schedules, and operational procedures. This intelligence advantage compounded the effectiveness of shallow water attacks by enabling precise targeting of high-value assets and optimal timing of assault operations. Tang's intelligence gathering revealed Japanese shipping patterns that reflected continued confidence in shallow water security. Transports followed predictable routes through coral channels, maintaining schedules that assumed minimal threat from submarine interdiction. High-value cargoes moved through areas where traditional submarines posed no danger, creating opportunities for precision attacks on irreplaceable equipment and personnel. The pattern of systematic intelligence gathering by shallow water submarines created a force multiplication effect that extended far beyond individual attacks. American submarine forces developed comprehensive knowledge of Japanese coastal operations, enabling coordinated campaigns that targeted critical vulnerabilities with devastating precision. The intelligence advantage was sustained by Japanese inability to acknowledge shallow water submarine presence, which prevented countermeasures that might have limited American intelligence collection. By late 1943, American shallow water submarines were achieving strategic effects that exceeded their numerical strength through precision targeting of critical Japanese assets. The destruction of specialized equipment, trained personnel, and irreplaceable supplies created cascading failures that paralyzed Japanese operations across entire theater commands. The mathematical relationship between American effort and Japanese losses demonstrated the decisive advantage achieved through tactical innovation that enemy forces couldn't acknowledge or counter. The psychological impact of sustained shallow water operations began affecting Japanese morale throughout coastal commands. Naval personnel found themselves under constant threat in waters previously considered absolutely secure. The unpredictability of submarine attacks created persistent stress that degraded operational effectiveness even when actual attacks didn't occur. Japanese forces began exhibiting symptoms of chronic anxiety that affected decision-making and operational procedures across entire command structures. Commander Nakajima Tadashi, who served with coastal defense forces in the Marshalls, described the psychological toll of shallow water submarine warfare in his post-war testimony. "We knew submarines watched us constantly from waters where submarines shouldn't exist. Every movement had to assume enemy observation from impossible locations. The stress of operating under constant invisible threat degraded our effectiveness more than actual attacks. We began avoiding operations in areas we controlled because we feared enemies who couldn't be there." The cascade of psychological effects demonstrated how tactical innovation could achieve strategic impact through mechanisms beyond simple material destruction. Japanese forces began modifying operational procedures to account for submarine threats in areas where submarine presence remained officially impossible. These modifications created inefficiencies and delays that multiplied the strategic impact of American shallow water operations far beyond their direct material effects. The institutional resistance to acknowledging shallow water submarine capabilities created systematic vulnerabilities that American forces exploited with increasing effectiveness. Japanese defensive planning continued to assume traditional submarine limitations, while American submarines operated according to completely different tactical parameters. This mismatch between assumption and reality created predictable patterns of Japanese vulnerability that enabled sustained American success in seemingly impossible conditions. USS Harder, commanded by Samuel Dealey, demonstrated the ultimate evolution of shallow water warfare through operations that systematically destroyed Japanese destroyer forces in their own controlled waters. Dealey's tactics represented the culmination of shallow water tactical development, using ultra-shallow positioning to achieve ambush opportunities impossible under traditional submarine doctrine. The results transformed shallow water submarine warfare from harassment technique to decisive tactical capability. Harder's destroyer hunting campaign required technical innovations that pushed shallow water capabilities beyond theoretical limits. The submarine operated in depths so restricted that diving became impossible, forcing reliance on surface camouflage and concealment techniques borrowed from coastal warfare. Attack solutions required split-second timing that left no margin for error, as escape opportunities didn't exist in the restricted waters where Harder conducted operations. The precision required for destroyer attacks in shallow water exceeded anything attempted in conventional submarine warfare. Dealey's crew achieved firing solutions through visual observation and acoustic ranging, compensating for the lack of traditional periscope and sonar capabilities in the ultra-shallow environments where destroyers could be ambushed. The technical mastery required for such operations represented the absolute pinnacle of shallow water submarine development. The success of Harder's destroyer hunting campaign eliminated Japanese anti-submarine capabilities in entire ocean areas, creating secure operating environments for other American submarines. The systematic destruction of Japanese destroyers removed the primary counter to American submarine operations, enabling increasingly aggressive campaigns that approached the Japanese home islands themselves. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual victories to reshape the fundamental balance of naval power in the Pacific. Japanese attempts to counter Harder's operations revealed the complete bankruptcy of anti-submarine doctrine designed for conventional threats. Destroyer commanders found themselves hunted by an enemy that operated in waters where enemy presence was theoretically impossible. The psychological impact of being systematically destroyed by invisible opponents created panic reactions that further degraded Japanese anti-submarine effectiveness. The final demonstration of shallow water submarine supremacy came with coordinated operations by multiple American submarines acting in concert to destroy entire Japanese fleet units in supposedly secure anchorages. These operations represented the complete maturation of shallow water warfare from experimental technique to decisive strategic capability. The coordination required for multi-submarine shallow water operations exceeded the complexity of any previous submarine warfare.
demonstrating American mastery of tactical innovation that had revolutionized naval combat. The systematic destruction of Japanese coastal shipping through shallow-water submarine warfare created logistical collapse that preceded military defeat throughout the Pacific theater. By early 1944, Japanese forces found themselves isolated in island strongholds, cut off from resupply networks by an enemy that dominated waters previously considered secure from submarine threat. The cascading failures triggered by shallow-water submarine operations created conditions for systematic Japanese defeat across the entire Pacific campaign.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.